I have this article from CNN, and the headline reads, in Huntington Beach, a George Floyd protest was deemed an unlawful assembly. A stay-at-home protest 1 month ago was not. So, of course, the way this article is framed is to show a contrast between the way that this particular writer, who is Saba Hamidi, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that right, along with Alexandra Meeks. They write this article, and what they're talking about is the Huntington Beach protests that occurred a couple weeks ago in regards to the beaches being closed and people being upset about the specific orders that were put in place. One of the interesting aspects of that, by the way, was that what had happened was several beaches in California had been opened at that time. And then there were some images that were like this one. There were some images that were revealed that showed a massive amount of people congregating on the beach. And then Governor Newsom specifically closed down Huntington Beach. Now, after this, there was a rather massive protest. And of course, at least from my perspective, the governor's Newsom's order was completely ineffective because it did exactly the opposite of what it was supposed to do. People weren't congregating on the beach. Instead, they were congregating in a huge protest. And most of them were not wearing masks. Obviously, most of them were not practicing any kind of social distancing. So it had the complete opposite effect of what Governor Newsom had actually intended. Now, the way that this article sort of treats things is they're trying to show a contrast between how that particular protest was treated as opposed to the more recent protests that have occurred in regards to the death of George Floyd. So the George Floyd protests, and basically trying to say that, well, they didn't really, didn't treat the George Floyd protesters with the same, I guess, respect as they treated the lockdown protesters, and basically trying to imply that part of it is because this is Orange County, and these the other protesters were Republicans, and the George Floyd protesters are perceived as more Democrats, and all sorts of silly things like that. Well, I went ahead and did a little bit of research, and it only took me about 5 seconds with Google. That's all it took me to do, 5 seconds. And then I found another report related to this same story. And this is from the local, one of the local network affiliates in the area. So this one is from ABC7, which covers that particular area of the country, basically LA, Orange County, that entire area. And this headline, which was actually done early this morning, reads, Orange County protests, gatherings in Huntington Beach, Santa Ana broken up by police. So this one is a short article just detailing the fact that there were some violent protests in Huntington Beach and Santa Ana. And this is the part that I think is really, really interesting. So it says in Huntington Beach, about 500 people gathered around Pacific Coast Highway and Main Street, including a number of counter protesters. As conflicts between the two groups escalated, police declared an unlawful assembly and asked people to disperse. So, in fact, the protesters, very likely the lockdown protesters, were at this particular demonstration. They apparently started to fight with the George Floyd protesters, and that's why we had an unlawful assembly. And that's not in the CNN article at all. At all. The fact that there was this confrontation between the two different groups. And that's why I say it's a distraction.
So, CNN, you said, did not report that that there was a fight between the two groups of protesters.
No, they didn't even acknowledge the fact that there was any kind of counter protest going on. That's not even part of the story. They don't even mention it. All they do is show the quote unquote contrast between the way that the George Floyd protesters were treated as opposed to the lockdown protesters, not mentioning that apparently the lockdown protesters showed up at the other protests and they started fighting. And that's very obvious in this article that that's what happened, is that there was a conflict between the two groups, which interestingly enough, I would like to mention that we haven't heard a lot of counter protesting news. And that's kind of been somewhat surprising to me. It's not completely surprising to me, but I haven't heard a lot of stories about counter protesters and people, like say Blue Lives Matters or anything like that. I haven't heard anything like that. This is the first time I've heard anything, and it's just this very small blurb in this particular article. But I want to just point out again, the reason that I call this a daily distraction is it took me 5 seconds to Google this and find this out. And CNN couldn't be bothered to mention that, yes, it looks like those same protesters that they're saying were treated with kid gloves, because that's basically the slant of the article, is that the lockdown protesters were treated with kid gloves. The George Floyd protesters were run off with tear gas. No, it looks like they were both there at the same time and started to fight with each other. At least that's what it looks like according to this this article here.
Now, are you saying, to just back up a second, that you think there are a lot more counter protests going on than are being reported on?
I'm saying I'm surprised that I haven't heard another story like this. This is the first one I've heard. I don't know if you've heard of any other stories like that, Pete, but this is the first one that I've heard, and I had to do a little bit of digging to find it. And I don't understand why it wasn't in the much larger. This article is very small, by the way. You can kind of see as I scroll through it. I mean, that's it.
Right.
That's all there is. It's a very short blurb. There is video. There is some extensive video. You can see, obviously, that there are police cruisers out here. The police did take an intersection there. And you can see that there are people gathered all around. But there isn't very much in terms of the article itself. There's very little. And I just feel like it's incredibly telling to me that CNN would completely omit this story, because to me it is a big story. And again, it's not that they're not covering something, or that they are covering something that I don't think is worthy of their coverage. It's the way they're covering it and the obvious spin they have to that coverage. And again, this is a big story, just not the way that CNN framed it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much news going on right now. It's really hard to get a handle on what matters and what doesn't. Stories that you would have thought would have been a lot bigger are just completely down the memory hole. Even the president fighting with Twitter, threatening to shut down Twitter this week. That story has basically taken the back seat, has been put on the back burner because you have these riots going on. It's just sucking up all the oxygen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be one of our main segments today, because we're going to be talking about that in detail a little bit later.